The papers were spread across the mahogany desk in front of me, and my hand was shaking so badly I could barely hold the pen. My husband sat beside me in that lawyer's office, his knee pressed against mine, his hand resting on my back in a way that looked like affection to everyone in the room. But I felt the pressure of his fingers, steady and deliberate, a silent reminder of exactly what he expected me to do. And then the room tilted. The walls slid sideways, the ceiling dropped, and the last thing I remember before everything went dark was the sound of my husband telling the lawyer, in his calm, measured voice, that I was simply overwhelmed by the paperwork, that I got confused by numbers, that I had always been that way. What he didn't count on was what the paramedics found when they arrived. But I'm getting ahead of myself. To understand how I ended up unconscious on the floor of a law office at 63 years old, you have to understand how it all began. And like most things that eventually destroy you, it began with something that felt like being saved. My name is Carol, and I had been a widow for 2.5 years when I walked into the Millbrook Public Library on a rainy Tuesday morning to return 3 books I had barely opened. My husband of 31 years, Thomas, had died of a heart attack the previous spring, and I had spent those 2.5 years learning how to exist in a house that still smelled like him. I wasn't depressed, exactly. I was just quiet in a way I hadn't been before. My daughter, who lived 4 hours away in Atlanta with her husband and 2 boys, called every Sunday and worried out loud about me being alone. I told her I was fine. I believed it, mostly. The library had become my anchor. I had volunteered there every Tuesday and Thursday for years, shelving books, helping with the after-school reading program, organizing the large print section that the older patrons used. It gave my weeks a shape. And that morning, when I walked through the glass doors and shook the rain from my umbrella, I noticed a man I had never seen before standing at the reference desk, asking the young librarian a question about local property records. He was tall, probably mid-60s, with silver hair and the kind of posture that suggested he had spent decades standing in front of people. He wore a dark green jacket and spoke in a low, careful voice. When I passed behind him on my way to the back room, he turned and apologized for blocking the aisle, even though he wasn't blocking anything at all. His name was Richard. He was a retired college professor, English literature, he told me later. He had moved to Millbrook 6 months earlier after his wife passed away following a long illness. He had chosen the town because it was quiet and had a good library, he said, and he smiled when he said it, as though he knew exactly how that would land with me. We talked for nearly an hour that first morning, standing between the shelves, while the rain hit the windows and the library stayed mostly empty around us. He came back on Thursday. And the Thursday after that. By the end of the month, he was meeting me for coffee after my volunteer shifts at the small cafe 2 blocks from the library. He brought me books he thought I would enjoy and wrote little notes inside the front covers, not romantic notes, at first, just observations about passages he had marked. Things like this reminded me of something you said last week, or I think you'll argue with this chapter, and I hope you do. I did argue with it. I loved arguing with it. For the first time in years, I felt my own mind waking back up. My daughter was cautious when I told her about him. She asked all the practical questions. How long had I known him? What did I know about his background? Had I spoken to anyone who knew him before Millbrook? I answered her questions patiently and told her she would like him when she met him. She said she hoped so. She drove up for a weekend 2 months in, and the 3 of us had dinner at my house, and afterward she told me privately that he seemed kind, thoughtful, that she could see why I enjoyed his company. What she couldn't see yet, what I couldn't see either, was how carefully he had arranged every moment of that dinner, the wine he had suggested I serve, the topic he guided the conversation toward when my daughter began asking him about his late wife, the particular way he had complimented my cooking in front of her enthusiastically, generously, so that she left that weekend feeling reassured. He was very good at reassurance in those early months. It was practically an art form. We were married 14 months after we met, in a small ceremony at the courthouse with my daughter and son-in-law as witnesses. I wore a blue dress that Thomas had always liked on me, and I felt a small pang about that, but also something that felt genuinely like hope. I had not expected to have this again. I was grateful for it. We moved into my house, the one I had shared with Thomas, because it was paid off and larger than the apartment Richard had been renting. He said he was happy with the arrangement. He donated most of his furniture to a church thrift store and brought only his books, which filled an entire room that we converted into his study. He said it was important for him to have a space to think. I said, of course. I thought nothing of it then. The first sign was so small I filed it away without even realizing I had done it. About 3 weeks after the wedding, I was telling him about a conversation I'd had with a woman from my Tuesday volunteer group. Her name was Patrice, and we had been friends for years about a book club she was trying to start. She wanted me to help her organize it. I was excited about it. Richard listened, and when I finished, he was quiet for a moment and then said, very gently, that he wondered whether Patrice was the right person to be taking direction from on literary matters. That she struck him as someone with enthusiastic but somewhat undiscriminating taste. He had met Patrice exactly once, briefly, in the library parking lot. I said I thought she had wonderful taste, actually. He smiled and said, of course, if I felt that way. And that was the end of it. But I noticed, over the weeks that followed, that when Patrice came up in conversation again, there was always something a slight pause, a careful neutrality in his expression, a comment phrased just delicately enough that I couldn't quite call it criticism. I just want to make sure you're spending your time with people who genuinely challenge you, he said once. You're too intelligent for relationships that don't grow you. It sounded like a compliment. I understand now that it was a door being closed. The book club never happened. I told Patrice I was still settling into married life and maybe in a few months. A few months became 6 months, became a year, became never. By the time I understood what had happened, Patrice had stopped asking. The pattern spread outward from there, slowly enough that I kept missing it. My Thursday shifts at the library became a source of quiet friction. Not that he ever told me to stop, he was too careful for that. But he began scheduling things on Thursday afternoons. Doctor's appointments he needed company for. Errands that somehow required 2 people. Small domestic crises that materialized reliably on the one day of the week I had somewhere to be. When I pointed this out once, he looked genuinely puzzled and said he wasn't aware he had been doing that, and that I should absolutely go to the library if it was that important to me. He said that important in a way that made me feel small for wanting it. I reduced my shifts to Tuesday only. 6 months later, I stopped going altogether. I told myself it was temporary. The money was more gradual still. Thomas and I had shared finances completely, every account joint, every decision made together. With Richard, it started differently. He suggested, early in the marriage, that it made sense for him to manage the household finances, since he had more time and was, frankly, more organized about numbers. He said it lightly, almost apologetically. I was still working through the estate paperwork from Thomas's death and was genuinely tired of financial documents, so I agreed. I gave him access to my accounts. I thought of it as a division of labor. Within a year, I had a household allowance. He didn't call it that. He called it your spending money and transferred the same amount into a separate account on the first of each month, $300. He said it was more than enough for personal items and that anything larger we should discuss together so we could make smart decisions. When I asked once about the balance in our joint savings account, my savings, the ones from Thomas's life insurance, he said he had moved them into a different instrument for better returns, and he would explain it when he had time to do it properly. He never found the time. I should have pushed harder, I know that now. But he had a way of making financial questions feel like evidence of distrust, and I was trying so hard, in those years, to be a good partner, to not be suspicious, to not be the kind of person who assumed the worst. Thomas had trusted me completely and I had trusted him. I wanted that again. I was willing to work for it. What I kept tripping over, what I couldn't explain away no matter how I tried, was the way he talked to me when no one else was in the room. It was never loud. He never raised his voice. That was the thing that made it hardest to name, for the longest time. It was the tone, quiet and precise, the one he used when he was explaining something to me that he felt I should already understand. When I mispronounced a word at dinner, we were alone. There was no audience. It didn't matter, he would stop whatever he was doing and correct me, and then move on without comment, as though he had done me a service. When I shared an opinion about something I had read, He had a habit of listening with a slight tilt of his head and then saying, "That's one way to look at it," and offering what he clearly considered the correct interpretation. After a while, I stopped sharing opinions. When my daughter called on Sundays, I kept the conversations cheerful. She had her own life, her boys, her husband's parents getting older. I didn't want to add to her weight. When she asked how things were, I said fine, good, busy. She asked once if I was happy, and I said yes without thinking, because I had gotten very efficient at not thinking about it. The moment everything shifted was not dramatic. It never is. It was a Saturday afternoon in October. I had driven myself to the hardware store. Richard had taken my car to the mechanic that morning and been dropped back without it, which meant I was borrowing his to pick up some weather stripping for the back door. A simple errand. I was gone 40 minutes. When I got back, he was sitting in the kitchen, and before I had even put down my keys, he asked me where I had been. I said the hardware store. He said he had called my cell phone 3 times. I said I hadn't heard it. I must have left the ringer off. He looked at me for a long moment and then said, very calmly, that he hoped I understood that when he couldn't reach me, he worried, that at my age, anything could happen, that he simply needed to know where I was for his own peace of mind. At my age, I was 62 years old and had been driving myself around independently for 45 years, but in that sentence I became someone fragile and unreliable, someone who needed to be tracked, someone who owed accountability for a 40-minute errand. I said I understood. I apologized. And somewhere in the back of my mind, behind the apology, something quiet and furious woke up. I started paying closer attention after that. I noticed that every time my daughter mentioned visiting, Richard found a reason. It was a bad weekend, the house was being painted. He had an old colleague coming through. He thought it might be nicer to see her at Christmas when there was more time. My daughter lived 4 hours away. She had visited twice in 2 years of marriage. I had not understood, until that October afternoon, that this was not coincidence. I noticed that when I cooked dinner, he described everything in terms of how it compared to something better. Not his late wife, he was cleverer than that, but to a restaurant we'd been to, or to the way his mother had made the same dish, or simply to an unspecified standard that the meal fell short of. It was always framed as helpful. If you add the garlic later in the process, it won't be so sharp. What it felt like, cumulatively, was being graded. Every evening, graded. I noticed that I had not had a conversation with another woman, a real conversation, not a 2-sentence exchange at the grocery store in months. I noticed that I had not read a book I'd chosen for myself in almost a year. The books on my nightstand were ones he had recommended. When I read them, I shaped my responses around what I knew he wanted me to find in them. I noticed that I was always tired in a way that sleep didn't fix. The paperwork request came in January. Richard sat me down one evening after dinner and explained that for tax purposes, it would be beneficial to consolidate the property holdings, my house, the only significant asset I had, into a joint trust that he would manage. He had prepared materials. He had already spoken to a lawyer, a man I had never met, whose office was 40 minutes away. He had scheduled an appointment for the following Thursday. I asked him to walk me through it slowly. He did. He was patient and thorough, and I understood perhaps 60% of what he explained, and when I asked clarifying questions about the parts I didn't understand, he answered them in a way that made me feel the questions had been slightly foolish. By the end of the conversation, I had agreed to go to the appointment. That night, after he went to sleep, I lay in the dark for a long time. Then I got up, went to the kitchen, and called my daughter. It was 11:30. She answered on the second ring. I talked for an hour and a half. I told her things I had not told anyone, things I had barely allowed myself to think. She listened without interrupting. When I finally stopped, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Mom, I'm coming Thursday." I told her the appointment was Thursday. She said, "I know." My daughter called a lawyer of her own the next morning, not the one Richard had chosen. A woman she found through a colleague, someone who specialized in estate law and had an office in our town. She told this lawyer, in broad strokes, what I had described. The lawyer asked several questions. Then she asked my daughter to make sure I did not sign anything at Thursday's appointment until I had spoken to her privately. I went to the appointment. Richard drove us, which meant I had no way to leave independently. He sat beside me at the desk with his knee pressed against mine and his hand on my back. The lawyer, a man with a smooth, unhurried manner, slid the papers across the desk and explained where I needed to sign. Richard uncapped a pen and held it out to me. The room tilted. I don't know, even now, whether it was the stress or the months of not eating properly because nothing I made was ever quite right, or simply my body refusing to participate any further. But I went down fast and completely, the pen rolling away across the floor. And then I was on the carpet and there were voices above me and my husband's voice was among them, calm and unhurried, explaining to the room that I was prone to these episodes under stress, that I was not good with paperwork, that someone should call a car to take us home. What he did not know was that my daughter was in the parking lot. She had driven up that morning, 2 hours before the appointment, and waited. When the paramedics arrived, called by the lawyer's receptionist, not by my husband, my daughter was behind them, walking through the door, and she told them clearly that she was my daughter and my next of kin and she needed to be with me. At the hospital, while Richard sat in the waiting room, my daughter was in the examination room beside me. The doctor was a woman, maybe 40, with tired eyes and a careful manner. She asked me standard questions. She ordered blood work. And then she looked at the results and asked me quietly when I had last had a full meal. I thought about it. A real meal, something substantial. I said I wasn't sure. Maybe a few days. I hadn't been very hungry lately. She asked if I had been under a great deal of stress. I looked at my daughter. My daughter looked at me. The doctor wrote some things down. She said I was severely underweight for my frame. I had lost 19 pounds in the past year, weight I had not noticed losing because it had gone so gradually. She said my blood pressure was low in a way that concerned her. She said she wanted to keep me overnight for observation. Then she asked if there was anything I wanted to tell her about my home situation. My daughter reached over and held my hand. And I told the doctor the truth. Not everything, not all at once, but enough. Enough that she called a social worker, who sat with me for 2 hours while my daughter waited outside. Enough that by the time Richard was brought back to my room, there were 3 other people present, and the conversation that followed was not the one he had expected to have. He was very composed. I will give him that. He frowned with what looked like genuine concern. He said he hadn't realized things had gotten so difficult for me. He said I had seemed happy. He said he had always tried to do right by me and was heartbroken to hear I felt otherwise. He was performing for the room, and for the first time I watched him do it and understood exactly what I was seeing. My daughter had already spoken to the lawyer she had contacted. Because I had not signed anything at the appointment, no property had transferred. My house was still mine, with my name on it, the same name Thomas and I had put on the deed 30 years earlier. My savings accounts were another matter. Those required more work, but they were not gone. They were accessible. There was a process. I did not go home with my husband that evening. My daughter drove me to her car, and we went to a hotel 10 minutes from the hospital. And I sat on the edge of the bed in a room with neutral curtains and a humming refrigerator, and felt the particular silence of a space that belonged to no one and required nothing of me. She ordered room service. A real meal. More food than I'd eaten in a sitting for a year. I ate most of it. Richard sent 11 text messages that night. I read the first 3 and then put my phone face down on the nightstand. My daughter offered to block his number and I told her to give me until morning. By morning, I had read the rest. I did not respond to any of them. The months that followed were not simple. They never are. There was a divorce, which took time and required more lawyers and more documents and more rooms I had to walk into and speak clearly in, which I did. There was the financial accounting, which revealed that a substantial portion of my savings had been moved into accounts in his name alone, money that had to be fought for through formal legal proceedings. Some of it I recovered. Some of it the process made not worth pursuing. I made peace with that calculation. There was the harder work of explaining to myself how it had happened. How I, a woman who had managed a household and raised a daughter and navigated 31 years of genuine partnership with Thomas, had found myself at 63 years old in a lawyer's office signing away my own house while my body shut itself down in protest. I spent a long time with that question. I sat with a therapist, once a week, in an office with a small plant on the windowsill, and I said things out loud that I had not let myself think for 2 years, and it was useful in the way that painful things are sometimes useful. What I came to understand was this: he had chosen me carefully. Not because I was weak, I was not weak, I had never been weak, but because I was alone and grieving and hungry for the particular thing he was very skilled at providing in the early months, which was the feeling of being seen and intellectually valued. He had spoken to my strength and used it as a lever. Every time I had doubted myself, I had pushed the doubt away because I was committed to being a good partner, to not being paranoid, to not letting grief make me suspicious of happiness. My own best qualities had been the tools he used against me. Understanding that took time. I am still understanding it some days. What I know for certain is this: my house is mine. It always was. My daughter calls on Sundays, and now she also calls on Wednesdays and sometimes on random Tuesday evenings just because something reminded her of me, and I answer every single time. Patrice and I started the book club. Finally, 6 women, third Tuesday of every month. Wine and argument and genuine laughter, and I have argued about books more in the past 8 months than I had in the previous 3 years combined. I went back to the library on a Thursday. I am not the woman who stood trembling in a lawyer's office, my body so depleted it chose unconsciousness over compliance. I was always more than that woman, even when I had forgotten it. I am 63 years old and I am learning, again, how to take up my own space in rooms, in conversations, in the quiet of my own home with a book I chose, and a cup of tea gone warm on the table beside me, and no one at all waiting for me to account for myself. If any part of this sounds familiar, if you recognize the small erosions, the quiet corrections, the gradual shrinking of your own world, please don't do what I did and file it away. Talk to someone. Your daughter, a friend, a doctor, a stranger on the phone at a hotline. Say it out loud, even once, even if your voice shakes. Because here is the thing no one told me clearly enough. And I want to tell you now. You do not have to be hit to be hurt. You do not have to wait for it to get worse. And the life you were living before someone convinced you to make yourself smaller is not gone. It is waiting for you to come back to it. I know, because I went back. And it was still there.